Now, ladies and gentlemen, here with tonight's top 10 list, the host of The Tonight Show for 30 years, Johnny Carson.
An A-list star throws a drink in Johnny Carson's face. A Las Vegas legend threatens to beat him up in his own office. A hand-picked protégé betrays him for a rival network. These weren't just bad nights on The Tonight Show. These were career-ending mistakes. Johnny Carson was a loyal friend, but he was a terrifying enemy. Tonight, we're digging into the secret blacklist of 8 guests who pushed the king too far. They were banished from his kingdom forever, and some of their careers never recovered from the blow. The father-daughter fight that ended a career. Of all the names on Johnny Carson's blacklist, one stands above all others. This one wasn't about an on-air argument or a drunken outburst. This one, for Johnny, was personal. This was about loyalty. This was about Joan Rivers. You see, Joan Rivers wasn't just a guest. She was the guest. In the early 1980s, Carson had essentially crowned her as his heir apparent. He made her the permanent guest host of The Tonight Show, a position that had never existed before. This was a massive deal. It meant that when Johnny was on vacation, Joan was the one behind the desk. He didn't just give her a platform, he gave her his stamp of approval. Their bond was famously close. She called him her mentor, and he treated her like a daughter. He had discovered her in a comedy club in the 1960s when she was struggling, and he brought her onto the national stage. Her career, by her own admission, existed because of Johnny Carson. He was, to put it mildly, the most important man in her professional life. But here's the thing about show business. Loyalty is a tricky word. In 1986, a new network called Fox was trying to build itself from nothing. They needed a big star to launch their late-night programming, someone who could actually compete with the unstoppable force of The Tonight Show. They set their sights on Joan Rivers. They offered her a deal that was impossible to refuse. Her own show, opposite Johnny, for a massive paycheck. Joan was terrified. She knew what this meant. She knew it would be seen as a declaration of war. What many overlooked is that Joan agonized over the decision. She desperately wanted to tell Johnny herself, to explain that this was a business move, not a personal one. She called his office, trying to get him on the phone, but Carson was a notoriously private man and hard to reach. She never got the chance. Before she could talk to him, Johnny read the news in a trade paper. He was completely blindsided. To him, this wasn't business. This was the ultimate betrayal. His daughter had not only abandoned him, but she had become his direct competitor without even having the decency to tell him to his face. Carson's reaction was swift and absolute. He didn't just ban her from The Tonight Show, he erased her. He never, ever spoke her name on air again. But it went deeper than that. He never spoke to her again. Joan tried to call him immediately after the news broke. The second Johnny heard her voice on the line, he hung up. That was it. The door didn't just close, it was welded shut, barred and cemented over. The fallout was catastrophic. Joan's new show on Fox was a disaster. The network executives who had promised her the world turned on her, criticizing her every move. The show was canceled after a short run. In the middle of this professional collapse, Joan's husband and producer, Edgar Rosenberg, faced a devastating personal tragedy and took his own life. In her darkest moment, drowning in grief and professional ruin, Joan reached out to her old mentor one last time. She called Johnny, hoping for a single word of comfort from the man who had been her father figure. He wouldn't even take the call. This ban wasn't just for a few years, it was permanent. Johnny Carson retired in 1992 and Jay Leno took over. Even then, Joan Rivers was not invited back. The unspoken message from the network was clear. As long as Johnny was alive, his blacklist was law. Carson passed away in 2005. Still, Joan was not invited back. The ban outlived the man who made it. It's crazy to think about the sheer power he held. It wasn't until 2014, a staggering 26 years after her ban began, that new host Jimmy Fallon finally broke the curse and had her on as a guest. It was a triumphant return, but the scar remained. Joan Rivers, even after rebuilding her career, would get emotional when talking about Johnny. She had lost more than a job. She had lost the man who made her. And for Carson, he had lost the one person he trusted, and that was a sin he would never forgive. But if Joan's ban was personal, the next guest learned what happens when you threaten the king physically. "I'll beat you up," Not all of Carson's feuds were slow-burning betrayals. Some exploded in an instant. That's what happened with Mr. Las Vegas himself, Wayne Newton. For years, Carson had a running gag in his monologue about Wayne Newton. Johnny would make jokes about Newton's high-pitched voice and his famously smooth and unchanging appearance. To put it mildly, the jokes often hinted that Newton wasn't the manly performer he presented himself as. For a long time, Newton just ate it. It was part of the business. But one night, Carson's jokes hit a nerve. The material veered too far into personal territory, questioning Newton's manhood in a way that, in that era, could be career-damaging. Wayne Newton wasn't having it, but he didn't call his publicist. He didn't send an angry letter. Instead, he decided to handle it man-to-man. The next day, Wayne Newton showed up, unannounced, at the Tonight Show studios in Burbank. He bypassed security because, well, he was Wayne Newton, and marched straight to Carson's private office. He walked in, and there was the king himself, preparing for that night's show. According to Newton, the conversation was short and not so sweet. He pointed his finger at Johnny and said, "I'm telling you this to your face. You've got to stop these jokes. If you don't, I'm going to beat you up." Now you have to understand, nobody talked to Johnny Carson like this. He was the undisputed king. But what many overlooked is that Carson was also a tough guy himself, a former Navy man. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. Carson just looked at him, ice cold, and reportedly said, "You're threatening me?" The confrontation was intense. Security eventually got involved and escorted Newton out. From that moment on, Wayne Newton was banned. Permanently. Carson was fine with jokes. He was fine with banter. But the thing nobody tells you is that he was obsessed with control. He would not be intimidated, and he would not be threatened in his own domain. By coming into his office and threatening him physically, Newton had crossed a line that, in Carson's mind, did not even have a "do not cross" sign, because no one had ever been foolish enough to get near it. Newton's career survived, of course. He was the king of Vegas. But he never, ever appeared on The Tonight Show again as long as Johnny was behind the desk. Newton learned not to threaten Carson, but our next guest made a different mistake. She humiliated him live on air. Banned for bad behavior. Shelley Winters was a Hollywood legend. She had 2 Academy Awards and a larger-than-life personality that made her a fantastic, if unpredictable, talk show guest. Johnny had her on many times, but her final appearance turned into one of the most infamous disasters in Tonight Show history. The problem, you see, was that Winters had a reputation for being difficult, and on this particular night, she arrived for the show clearly intoxicated. From the second she sat down, the interview was a train wreck. She was slurring her words, interrupting Johnny and rambling. Carson, the ultimate professional, was trying his best to steer the ship, to keep the interview coherent. He was visibly tense, but he kept his smile on. Then, he made a mistake. He tried to engage with her in some light banter, making a joke about her past. Winters, in her altered state, didn't take it as a joke. She snapped. She looked at fellow guest Oliver Reed, who was sitting next to her, and then back at Johnny. She picked up her glass, filled with water, or perhaps something stronger, and threw the entire thing right in Johnny Carson's face. The audience gasped. There was a stunned silence. Johnny just sat there, dripping wet, completely shocked. He was the most powerful man on television, and he had just been humiliated in front of 20 million people. He didn't yell, he didn't say a word. He just calmly said, "We'll be right back," and cut to a commercial. During that break, all chaos broke out. Winters was immediately escorted off the set, out of the building, and, essentially, out of Carson's life. He had to go to his dressing room, towel off, and change his entire suit and tie. When the show returned, she was gone. Johnny never mentioned her name again. She was banned for life. For Carson, this was another unforgivable sin. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the blatant disrespect. It was a guest losing control and destroying the carefully crafted professional environment he had built. You could be funny, you could be witty, but you could not, under any circumstances, get physical with the king. But not all bans were that explosive. The next guest was banned for simply being annoying. The man with no off switch. This next ban is a weird one, maybe the weirdest in Tonight Show history. It wasn't a screaming match in the green room. It wasn't a drunken on-air betrayal. It was a ghosting. In Hollywood, a town fueled by explosive feuds, firings, and public breakups, To simply have someone disappear from the ecosystem is a cold power move all its own. The guest was Rich Little, the master impressionist. For years, Little wasn't just a guest on Carson's couch. He was practically part of the furniture. He was one of Johnny's absolute favorite, most reliable guests. He appeared on the show dozens and dozens of times. In the high-stakes world of late-night booking, where one bad segment could tank the whole hour, Rich Little was a guaranteed home run. He was the safe bet, the booking producers loved him, and he always made the audience roar with his spot-on, timely impressions of celebrities and politicians. Then, one day, he just stopped appearing. The phone calls from the producers stopped coming. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. No Rich Little. What on earth happened? There was no public feud. There was no scathing article in the trades. There was no disastrous on-air incident that went viral. Little himself was completely baffled. His manager, no doubt sensing a career-defining problem, would call the show's powerful bookers. But the bookers, fiercely loyal to their king, would just politely brush him off. Sorry, Johnny's schedule is just packed. But a schedule is always packed. When it stays packed for a year, then 2, then 3, you know something is deeply wrong. The truth, it turns out, was a soft ban, an unofficial blacklisting, and it happened for 2 key reasons. The first reason? Johnny got sick of him off camera. You see, Rich Little was always on. He was a performance machine that had no off switch. The commercial breaks are sacred time on a talk show. It's when the host can take a breath, sip some water, and just be a normal human for 3 minutes. But when the cameras stopped rolling, Little kept performing. He'd lean over and talk to Johnny as Richard Nixon. He'd crack jokes to the producers as Jack Benny. He seemingly never, ever just spoke in his own voice. This drove Carson absolutely crazy. Johnny, despite his massive on-camera charisma, was a famously authentic and intensely private person. He was a Midwesterner at heart. He hated fake small talk, he despised phoniness, and he couldn't stand Hollywood types who were always performing. The last thing he wanted, after delivering a monologue and interviewing movie stars, was to be stuck next to a guy who wouldn't stop doing his act. It wasn't a conversation. It was a one-man show he hadn't asked for. It just wore him out. He found it, to be blunt, incredibly and profoundly annoying. The second reason was even more serious, at least to Carson. This wasn't personal, it was professional. Johnny was a student of comedy. He was a former magician, a man who respected craft and preparation above all else. He also had a famously photographic memory for jokes, and he started to notice that Rich Little was phoning it in. He was recycling material. He was telling the exact same jokes and using the exact same impressions he had used on the show a year earlier. He was treating the Tonight Show stage, the most important stage in show business, like a lazy Vegas lounge act. To Carson, the undisputed king of late night, this was the ultimate sin for a comedian. It was lazy. It was arrogant. It was, worst of all, disrespectful to the audience that tuned in every single night, trusting Johnny to bring them the best. Carson demanded perfection from himself and expected the best from his guests. He felt Little was coasting, and he would not stand for it. So what do you think? Was Carson a legend protecting his show, or a tyrant who ended careers? Let us know below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.